Okay, so one of the people I've been listening to recently, kind of a lot, is Mary Harrington. And I just want to preface this by the fact that I am not a disciple of Mary Harrington. Her position that she's against all progress is, I think, like an inflammatory publicity stunt. And there's a lot of reasons to get into that. But outside of her primary topic of research, which is women's studies, like the civil rights era and movement is an example of how preposterous it is to say that she's against progress. So I just want to first off state that I'm not aligned with her um, across the board. However, I do find that she's got some ideas that I'm enjoying being exposed to. And one of them is the way that she articulates the evolution of the feminist movement. And I think the way that she sees the development of women um, and like the enfranchisement and empowerment of women is just feels really spot on to me. So here's basically what she says. In the pre-industrial era, so this is like Middle Ages, basically before work was in factories, the household was the primary economic unit. Now, this also does not include, I think this is like a pretty westernized view, because obviously in situations in which like slavery was a mode of production, the household was not the primary economic unit, the plantation was. And then also in like Eastern countries where I think rice picking was one of the major economic drivers, I'm not sure how true this is. I just don't like have a lot of, I don't know a lot about it, but something about it make like I feel like maybe that's not the case. But in Western, probably like Western European pre-industrial era, the household was the primary economic unit, and both men and women labored in support of the production of what the home was producing, which was like, animal husbandry and farming. And the production and home life were united. So women were at home, men were also at home, and both people were contributing to the economic unit. And then what Harrington says is that the industrial era actually um, sort of ironically had the result that it demoted the status of women because production all of a sudden moved out of the home. And so when production moved out of the home, in order to be economically productive, women had to leave their children, which obviously a lot of them didn't do. So if they stayed at home, they suffered a loss of status and they lost direct control of the economic structure of the household. Um, so this is what would be kind of like first wave feminism. Um, and it's counterintuitive because you think of something like the Industrial Revolution improving freedom and living standards for everyone. But I think that there's there's a point here that makes a lot of sense, which is like when the marriage as the primary economic unit was like that was just frayed, then all of a sudden women just didn't have control anymore like over their economic life. Um, and then the next wave of change that Harrington really talks about is basically the introduction of the pill, which, as she says, separates sex from reproduction. And that allowed women to go out and be fully independent economic actors and have a lot of control over their bodily autonomy. And obviously, having control over your bodily autonomy is something that we typically think of as being really positive. But what that did was it continued to basically disenfranchise and further demote any woman who was focused on an economy of care, caregiving, mothering. And it made the act of mothering so much more expensive and unsupported. And so this is why Mary Harrington says she's against progress, because the results of the sociological and technological progress that we've seen over the last century have actually resulted in women being less empowered in the context of one of their primary biological activities, I guess, which is child rearing. And she basically thinks that the absolute freedom, or the greater freedom, that the Industrial Revolution and later the introduction of the pill and what she calls the transhumanist era ushered in, was the result was that it basically subjected sex and dating to a more free market. And the result of that free market is that the women who stood to gain the most succeeded and fared really quite well, but the rest of the women actually are worse off. And so, she's seeing that there's this market economy that doesn't have enough boundaries around it, is creating a great deal of inequality, which is obviously what we see in like a capitalism that's not constrained by values and community. So this is really interesting for me, returning to the roots of my feminist studies back from the time at Scripps. And Harrington is way more conservative than anybody I would have read at Scripps. And I can just see all the Scripps girls as like, ears bursting into flame if they had to read something like this. But I'm grateful for the exposure I had to those philosophical texts back in college, because it makes me a little more comfortable now approaching something like this. And yeah, I think it kind of helps me think about the role of marriage and what the role it would play in my life, because it kind of helps me position myself in the context of where I am relative to the evolution of women's role in an economic partnership. Super romantic. So yeah, if you are interested in Mary Harrington, I can send you 2 lectures that are the most interesting. And again, there are components of what she says that are inflammatory and that I have a really hard time getting behind. And she's just such a bitch, but she's smart. So those are my thoughts.